Welcome back to the final session of our day. It's a panel discussion. I have some questions here ready from previous sessions, so we will start with those, but we do encourage participants to ask questions in the live Q&A if they have any from previous sessions or if something comes up from this panel discussion. So let's start with the first one. In retrofitting a significant heritage building for resilience against natural disasters, is there a threshold of interference which is considered too much? Over to you guys.
I'll just quickly say to start, there certainly would be thresholds. I mean, any action on a heritage property would have to go through the DA process, and that process would determine, because those DAs are referred to the Heritage Council, and the Heritage Council would make an assessment about whether the action was seen to be too intrusive, that it would impact on heritage value as a sort of a standard process. So, I mean, certainly some actions would be, but then again, depending on the circumstances, some, large intrusive actions may be necessary, under different circumstances to save a building.
Sorry, if I could just add to that as well, and just things that people can look out for in general. So things that would be considered intrusive, obviously destruction of heritage fabric is something that we obviously look for. So, and it's not always case by case. You need to assess everything, and that's why you definitely need to get your heritage professionals involved. So if there's already been a lot of intrusions to the heritage fabric, then a further one would be looking like you shouldn't be doing it. But if there's none already, then a small incursion might be fine. Similarly, if it affects the interpretation of the place, that's another thing that, I spoke about that a bit in my talk as well. That's another thing that would alert you to an action that's probably going a bit too far. But very definitely you would be running it past state heritage to get their input at every stage.
Michael, you had something to add? Or...
No, well, I was just going to say that and sometimes it's the degree of intervention really, is also a matter for, I guess, compromise and discussion with the client. That client really ultimately, whether it's by legislation or some requirements, often I'd be taking a lot of advice, instruction from the client.
Is everyone happy on that question? Shall we move on? Okay, so this was during Michael's talk, so it will probably be directed at you. The question was, I noticed that the retrofitted resilience works looked noticeably yellow, new. Was this on purpose to identify them as new?
They were. That's just how the material was supplied by the timber company. But the treatment was, I suppose, to give them a bit more a longer life. But they were, in all of those applications, they were not visible to the public. They were in an area that most people, well, you would need a very extensive series of ladders to even access those parts of the building.
Understood. There was a follow-up to that, or a somewhat follow-up to that question. That was this so it could be reversible if needed? Now, obviously, that's not the case because it wasn't intentional. But of the question, I guess, if altered, any works that were undertaken are reversible potentially.
Yes. except for the chemical anchors that were installed into the masonry to connect the whatever stiffening that we added, the everything else was reversible, and the anchors could have just been cut off at the surface level, so that again they would be effectively invisible afterwards. So for all intents and purposes, those techniques we've used so far have been reversible.
Thank you. So we had two questions concerning tie downs. So the first was, what is the best approach for tie downs to stone walls with a plaster finish, chased or surface mounted? So Peter, you may be able to shed some light.
If it's solid masonry, the answer is vertically down in the middle of the wall, rather than surface mounted.
Okay. Thank you.
Technically, and it does involve, of course, moving some of the roof sheeting to be able to do it.
Okay. And the second question on roof tie downs was, should roof tie downs also be in stainless steel to guard against impacts of corrosion?
In my opinion, the chances of them corroding are very limited. Most of the acquisition of salt gravitates towards the base of any wall by the process of being washed down there essentially over time. So the salt acquisition tends to be near the base, so the absolute necessity that prevails in cavity walls to have stainless steel is not really the same for something where the risk is far less.
Excellent, thank you so much. So we had a question about the York residency roof sheeting. Why was the roof sheeting length changed from 2 laps to a single sheet length? Was that a conscious decision?
So I can't answer that, unfortunately. I wasn't there when that decision was made, so I would only be guessing.
No worries, thank you so much. Okay, well, we don't have any questions coming through at the minute, so I do encourage anyone listening to put their questions through in the live Q&A below. But
following on from the residency project, has there been interest from other property owners in town in York?
Okay, so following on from the residency project, has there been other interest from other properties in the town of York for what could be done for them?
So we held a session where we invited property owners to come in, meet the heritage professionals and talk through possibilities and funding opportunities. I am unaware of any that have then progressed to a project from that point, but that was certainly offered and there was a healthy interest at the time.
Okay, so as questions come in, we will ask them, but was there anything else that any of our incredible presenters in front of us would like to add to their presentation, or that they would like to question of each other? I'm sure that it would be great for you to, if you had questions about each other's presentations that you would love to be answered.
I was wondering if I might just add to the outcomes that we had out of the 2 projects and where useful work could be done to provide better information. And that is in the area where you are retrofitting for more than one hazard. So you get benefits from retrofitting for the other hazards that present a risk. So take in conjunction with earthquake. So in the economics that we've done so far, we've only considered earthquake, and even in that we haven't looked at all the possible benefits. For example, we haven't included the cost of emergency management response. We haven't included the cost of the local government having to clean up right after an event because you'll have masonry in the street and so on. So I think there's an opportunity to the information and look at more holistically at the benefits of what's being achieved. So if you're retrofitting your roof for wind, you're actually reducing the risk for that hazard. That has a benefit. If you're making your house more resilient to bushfire in a peri-urban area, there are benefits associated with that. And so I think there's a need to build on the work that's been done to get a more complete picture.
I'd just like to speak to that. At the present moment, we have in progress, which resembles rather a glacier moving, retrofitting of about 16 towns on the west coast, which were damaged by a cyclone. Most damage was Kalbarri. The dreadful truth is that the design wind speed was not achieved with that cyclone, but there was about $200 million worth of damage done. And at the present moment, there's a response, and that is to try to retroactively improve the capacity of existing buildings to resist the loads imposed by high winds. This is a concerted effort, and the Engineers Australia has a cyclone committee which is basically advising everybody in this. Jeff Borton is a man who's on that, and many of you may know him. Jeff is from James Cook University, and I'm on that committee along with the president of Engineers Australia here, and also Sean DePraser, who's a senior engineer for DMIRS, which is a government department. But the objective is to try to get people to spend a bit of money on making their buildings less vulnerable. We need a cultural change to see this sort of problem doesn't occur again. And to put this in perspective, the department responsible for the remediation side of things had a look what would have happened to Geraldton had Cyclone Seroja reached Geraldton, and concluded that 8,000 houses would have been demolished. Now, this sort of catastrophe has occurred before, and it is something which can't be regarded lightly and isn't being regarded lightly. Seismic activity is the same. It's very widespread from wherever the epicenter is, and the damage goes far beyond the so-called 200 million we're talking about. The number of people whose businesses are basically destroyed by this sort of event is legion, and this is never counted in the cost of the event. So the costs go far beyond the actual visible damage. We do about retrofitting buildings to resist these things is a hugely good investment.
Thank you. Okay, so I have another question. This is for Luke. In addition to the parade ground, are there other resilience projects planned for the Freo prison?
Thank you, Georgia. Yes, we're doing a lot of work at the moment around our hydraulic systems and drainage and repairing roof plumbing and all that sort of unglamorous work. Because really the main risk to our property in terms of building fabric is moisture, and so, but unfortunately, sort of moisture is very, very expensive to deal with. So we're really, really pushing that. We've been lucky to receive some significant funding from government to invest in making our site more resilient across the site, the impacts of, and so that's our big focus at the moment. But one thing I didn't get to in my presentation, when I was talking about, if we're talking about the preservation of heritage value, then there are two fundamental things. There's building fabric, but there's also authenticity of the site, and that's sort of referring to the ability of the site to express heritage value, and And one big way that a site can do that is through interpretation. And interpretation is another way, a fundamental way, as is, preservation of buildings themselves, but in how you interpret those buildings makes them resilient to the loss of heritage value. And so, for example, most of our historic heritage sites have lost significant fabric in the past, and yet when those buildings are interpreted effectively, then that doesn't equate to a loss of heritage value. So I just wanted to make that point that that resilience can come in different forms, and interpretation, the researching of the history, the telling of those stories, the building up the relationship with the community who values that heritage asset. All of those things contribute to resilience as well.
Thank you, Luke. Alina, have the conservation works in York at the Residency Museum had a positive impact on heritage tourism in the region?
Well, we're quite well known for heritage tourism anyway. So I would say COVID's had a massive impact on heritage tourism. We find at all our events and all our weekends, we have an awful lot of people, but we are finding the numbers at the Residency Museum up, and we're advertising more times for that. We've got some more staffing on in that space as well. Again, with luckily this time we've got our new professional curator, and we've got some staff who also have history degrees and have a real strong interest in being in that space, in a curatorial space long term, and they're adding value as well. We're definitely finding numbers at the museum increasing, and we are about to have our 50th anniversary of it being a residency museum as well. So that will be in August. So if everyone would like to look out for that and come and do a bit more heritage tourism in the town and enjoy the festivities we put on for the museum, come and see what we've done. Although a lot of it is hidden, we're happy to take you for a tour around to see it, and then come and enjoy the rest of York, because it's still, luckily enough, survived Meckering and all the other earthquakes since, and we can provide that fantastic opportunity for you to view all the heritage buildings down the strip as well. But if it's, we have also just run a heritage event recently in conjunction with the York Business Association for Heritage Week. And we're hoping to increase those events to encourage people to come along and enjoy the heritage of York even more. Thanks, Georgia.
That sounds like a great event, that 50th anniversary. So a question about retrofitting measures. Is the insurance industry generally supportive of these retrofitting measures?
I was wondering if I might be able to make a response to that initially. It's an interesting area with insurance, because the two projects you saw today did quantify the change in risk as the insurer would do it. But what we do understand from the insurance participation in the project is that the insurers don't necessarily price the policies on the local risk. And that's a contrast to other hazards like flood and bushfire, where very much it's based on the local risk to the property. So for insurance to be of greatest benefit, it would be where they're pricing based on the risk to your property, and therefore the change in risk. And that's happening in the cyclonic area. So if you think of Queensland, North Queensland, there's a program called the Resilience Scheme, which is managed by the Queensland government, where properties are being retrofitted for cyclones, the older properties, and they're getting a benefit with their insurance. So there's a number of participating insurers that give a discount. So that's presently isn't happening in the insurance area, but the information that's been developed could inform that down the track. But at this stage, it's not really clear, depending on where your property is and how it's priced, whether you'll actually see a benefit or not.
Does anyone else want to add to that topic of insurance?
One of the people participating in the Cyclone Seroja task force I mentioned is the Mayor of Karratha. And Karratha is a new town, city, I think it's a city now, which has been always designed for, or known be vulnerable to cyclonic wind loads. The present insurance per house for that area, because of the very poor performance of a lot of poorly designed and built properties there, is about $22,000 a year. Now, this sort of figure is something which makes, for most people, insuring their properties forbidding, and really basically they need to go without it. So some sort of resilience program marked with a recognition of this by insurance companies is subject of some discussion by the Cyclone Seroja Committee with the insurance industry.
Thank you for that. Does anyone else have any thoughts on insurance or shall we move on? All right, I've got one last question. Do you believe that government at all levels have a role to play and act as a catalyst to encourage owners to retrofit?
There's no doubt about it, in my opinion. This is being played out in other arenas too. One of the classics is in Queensland, where the issue of flooding in valleys that should never have had buildings built in it has been aggressively addressed by one council in concert with the federal and state government. They developed additional land out of the floodplain area, which could be occupied by people moving out of the floodplain valley, and offered them this land free. Now, they didn't get paid for the houses that are a problem in the floodplain, but they did get the opportunity to move to a higher land thing. Now, with the issue of retrofitting buildings in cyclonic zones, after Cyclone Tracy destroyed Darwin, basically because it was designed for much lower wind speeds, many of the towns in Western Australia, which were company towns fully owned by companies, were fully retrofitted for cyclonic resistance. We did a couple ourselves. But that sort of initiative isn't available when you have an open town where you have all sorts of people with different agendas.
Thank you for that. Does anyone else have anything to add?
I would like to add, if that's okay. So yes, I think that all level of government does need to look at that. Certainly at York, knowing that we would like to increase the uptake of the retrofit, we're looking at doing a CBD revitalisation over the next probably 5 to 10 years. And that's something we'll definitely be including, is working with all the businesses in town to make sure that we do get those measures put in, because as Mark mentioned earlier, the economic consequence of having building failure would, and as well as the safety, would be quite catastrophic to York. So we're going to absolutely lead that charge in our small town, and hope that other people would also follow that example. Thanks, George.
Fabulous. Anyone else?
Yeah, Georgia, I would just add that I agree entirely, and I think that Australia, at the highest levels, has been very good at putting its head in the sand about climate change and the impacts that are coming, and there's no avoiding it, and these things are happening and will happen more and more, and I'm just always endlessly surprised that it's not sort of higher on the agenda in things like the federal election and so on.
I suppose the difference there is we understand the value of heritage, and it's just making sure that everyone else understands that value too. All right. Did anyone else have anything to add on that point? No. Okay. If you are all amenable, I'm going to wrap up today. So thank you to all of our presenters today for offering their expertise and insight on such an important topic as disaster preparedness. I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow, all of our participants tomorrow, at 9 a.m. for day 2 of our conference. We have a diverse and fascinating program that you will not want to miss, from the topical subject of lessons to be learned from Cyclone Seroja through to significant projects undertaken on Mudgee, Rottnest Island, and information on important work the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage is doing on coastal erosion and bushfire risk. It is a day not to be missed, and I look forward to seeing you all then.
Okay. Thank you, Georgina.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.